Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Embassy Online Bible Study. My name is Matthew McGlade, the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church, where every Tuesday night we have a thought to think about, a question to ponder, and a text to study. It's a good opportunity to get involved in a small group, a life group, where you can do this learning together, discuss the questions together, study the Bible together. And as I say every week, that way we get much more out of our time together. Now, you remember that last week we were starting a new series, a Bible study series titled Trustworthy Truth. And we're looking at the reasons why we can trust the Bible. Why can we trust the Bible as a reliable historical document? Why we can trust the teaching, the life of Jesus and his experience, why we can trust also the truth that we believe as Christians that Christ rose from the dead. And you remember that last week we were looking at the Old Testament, but tonight what I want to do is I want to look at the question, why can I trust the New Testament? However, before we answer this question, I think it's really important that we look at what type of literature is the New Testament. You'll find that in the New Testament we have letters written by various authors like Paul or Peter or John. We have one interesting book in particular, which is what we call an apocryphal book. It's a book that, apocalyptic book, I should say. It's a book of prophecy that looks into the future. That's in the book of Revelation. But when we think of the Gospels and the actual Gospel accounts of Jesus' life, we see that actually it's a different type of literature, and it's what historians have called its biography. In other words, it's written to tell a life story of someone. But before we unlock a little bit of what we mean by biography, I want to read to you the opening words of Luke's Gospel in Luke chapter 1. And as we read these words together, I want to ask, do you think Luke intended this to be his fiction or his biography or his history? So Luke says in the opening part of his Gospel that many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I decided to write to you an orderly account. I decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you've been taught. And so I think we can all agree from that opening sentence in Luke's Gospel that Luke did not intend this to be a work of fiction, but actually a work of history, a work looking at the life of Jesus. And so when we look at the life of Jesus, we are looking at four Gospels that we know of, and each Gospel is a biography of the life of Christ. They give an historical account of Jesus' life, of his teachings, of his ministry, and according to the standards of their time, the Gospels, which we know as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written as ancient biographies. They were concerned not so much with the chronology of events of Jesus' life, the exact timing or the exact words of Jesus, verbatim as it were, but what they were more concerned with was giving an accurate portrayal of Jesus' life through eyewitness testimony. Now, if you've ever read the Gospels, you'll notice that three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very similar to each other. They look at Jesus' life from a similar perspective. In fact, over the years, they've been called the synoptic Gospels because they are looking from the life of Christ from a similar view. Mark's Gospel is believed to be the earliest Gospel that was written, and it's believed that Mark used Peter as his main source, eyewitness source of Jesus' life. We look at the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, we see that they borrowed a lot of material from Mark. Also, Matthew and Luke also borrowed material from another source that we don't know much about. And we look at Matthew's Gospel, we see that Matthew looked at Jesus' life from a Jewish perspective, whereas Luke looked at Jesus' life from a Gentile or a non-Jew perspective. And it's very clear that Luke used Mary as his source, a lot of his source to getting the information that he needed. And so each of these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels because they are telling a biography of Jesus' life from a similar perspective. Very different from the other Gospels is John's Gospel. And the reason it's different is because John is writing it himself as someone who has personally experienced Jesus. He's writing it from his own personal encounter of Christ. And it looks at Jesus in a very intimate way. And stylistically, you'll notice that John's Gospel is very different from the other Gospels. And for that reason, some people have sort of alleged that maybe John's Gospel was written somewhere in the 2nd century, many years after Jesus, maybe by a group of the early church. But I actually don't believe that's true. John's Gospel, I believe, was written by whom it is named to be written by John himself. In fact, the scholar Craig Keener says that John's Gospel is truly a biography. And John, although he is stylistically different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he does describe very much the same events that the other Gospel writers describe. And so there isn't any warrant to say that somehow that John's Gospel was made up by the early church somewhere in the 2nd century. So given then that the writers of the New Testament never intended the Gospels to be treated as legend, but as history, what evidence is it to show that the Gospels that we read are truly authentic? They really are written by the people that they claim to be written by. What evidence is there for us to trust in them, to say that no additions have been added to them later on, or they haven't been embellished with miracles that didn't happen? Well, I want to give you 3 reasons why we can trust the historical accuracy of the New Testament. The first reason is the abundance and the early dates of the New Testament copies. Sometimes the accusation that's leveled against the New Testament is that maybe stories were added, to the life of Jesus over time, that, people just made up myths or legends. And I want to test that and see, is that really true? Let's compare the New Testament to another history of that time, like, for example, the history of Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great lived 323 years before Christ, and yet the earliest records or copies that we have of his life isn't for nearly 500 years later. And in those records, no one would say that anyone has added any embellishments to the story of Alexander the Great. And every historian would regard those documents as reliable and trustworthy. Now, how does that compare to the New Testament and to the life of Jesus? Well, Jesus died and, it was believed, rose again somewhere in the year AD 30. And the earliest manuscripts or copies that we have of the New Testament are found in the year 125 AD, and that is a copy of John's Gospel. So that is actually 95 years after the life of Jesus. That's not 500 years, like from Alexander the Great to the earliest copies that we have of his life, but we have a time gap of 95 years after Jesus' life. John's Gospel was written somewhere about 90 AD. That's about 60 years after Jesus' life. That means there was about a 35-year gap from John writing his original Gospel to the earliest copies that we have of his Gospel. Now, that does not provide enough time for legends or embellishments or made-up stories to be made. And what that means is that the stories of Jesus' feeding of the 5,000, of walking on water, of all those miracles that we read, are highly likely to have happened. They're not things that were made up by other people over time, because the time gap between the original writings and the earliest copies is very, very small. In addition to that, as well as there being this short time gap, we also have an abundance of Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. In fact, we have over 5,300 Greek manuscripts, not Greek manuscripts, Greek manuscripts dating from the 2nd century AD onwards. And this is incredible, because what this shows is that we can look at all these Greek manuscripts, and if there's a big difference between them, that would suggest that maybe some stories were made up. But the fact is there isn't. In fact, there's only a very small variation in maybe some of those counts, and nothing that relates to Jesus' miracles or stories or anything that affects his teaching or what it means to live as a Christian life. They're very insignificant or small. And so, but that means that we can have confidence in our Bibles, that actually the New Testament is reliable. And sometimes, if you ever notice when you read your Bible, sometimes you might see there's a little footnote next to a certain story, and I might say in some manuscripts it says this, or some manuscripts that says that. And that's really just highlighted that there are some manuscripts, there are some slight variations, but no major variations that actually affect the main tenets of our faith in Jesus. And so we can trust the New Testament because of the early dates and the abundance of manuscripts. The second reason why we can trust the New Testament as authentic is the countercultural teachings of Jesus. You know, if you was a first century male, living 2,000 years ago, and you wanted to make up a new religion for whatever reason, there'd be a number of things you wouldn't do. You wouldn't say of your leader, your teacher, that he calls on his followers to pledge his allegiance to him before their own families. In a culture that is very highly family valued and driven, no one would say your allegiance needs to come to me before your family. No one would advocate drinking their own blood or eating their own flesh, even if they were speaking metaphorically. No one would admit to having someone in their inner circle that they chose who would later betray them and hand them over to the authorities, because that would show poor judgment on behalf of the leader. They wouldn't betray their followers as cowards in the greatest time of need when they ran away from their master when he was arrested. And yet all these things were true of Jesus' life. These things would be an embarrassment to have mentioned. If Jesus' disciples were making up a hoax for the purpose of setting themselves up as the rightful heirs of Jesus, it would be counterproductive for them to say these things about the Lord. And so in the light of this actually lends weight to the reliability of the New Testament, that it wasn't something that was made up, that it is something that is truly authentic. But the third reason why we can trust the reliability of the New Testament is the corroboration of outside sources. You know, the ancient historians like Tacitus, Sionatus, Pliny the Younger, Josephus, all confirm the key accounts of Jesus' life, his setting in Judea, his fulfillment of prophetic claims, that he was reported to be a miracle worker, his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, and the belief of his followers that Jesus had been risen from the dead. When the Roman historian Tacitus speaks of the followers of Jesus in his account called the Annals, he confirms details of the New Testament when he says that Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. And so even non-Christian historians of that time, the likes of Tacitus, confirm the findings of the New Testament. And so there's a confirmation with historians outside the New Testament. But it's not just the historians. There's also archaeological evidence that supports the New Testament. In the 1960s, a stone was found near the residence of King Herod that read as follows: to the honor his imperial benefactor, the Emperor Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. In addition, again in the 1960s, a bronze ring was found, and then recently Pontius Pilate's name was found inscribed on it. And so this is archaeological evidence that supports the New Testament's claim that Pontius Pilate lived. Recently, there was an archaeological discovery of the pool of Bethsaida, which fits the description of John in his Gospels of what it was like. Evidence of burial customs show that it wasn't always the case that when people were crucified that they were left as food to the animals. Sometimes bodies received a decent burial, as was the case with Jesus' body, that he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. All this provides evidence that supports the reliability of the New Testament. It shows that the Bible can be trusted as a historical source, and it should actually prompt the open-minded person to investigate the Christian claims. And you know what I've just said tonight and presented tonight is really just a small sample of the abundance of evidence that there is to support the reliability of the Bible. There's so much that we could look at, but we just don't have time to do tonight. And so I want you to know that the Bible is trustworthy. It's reliable. It's something that we can put our confidence in. And therefore, the account it presents to us of Jesus' life and his ministry is something that actually we can trust. It wasn't something that was made up by others. Guys, that's a thought to think about. A question to ponder is this: have you recently read any biographies? Who were they about? Do you think the Gospels do you think of the Gospels in the same way as you would a biography? How would you respond to the allegation that since the Bible contains miracle claims, it can't be true? And our text of study, I'd like you to read Luke chapter 1 verses 1 to 4, Acts chapter 1 verses 1 to 3. How does Luke intend his readers to treat his work? As a work of fiction or as a work of history? Guys, thanks for listening tonight. Hope you got something out of it. Hey, listen, have a great rest of the evening. Next week, we're going to start to look at the life of Jesus, and we're going to look at the question, why does it matter if the life and the story of Jesus is actually true? Guys, have a great rest of the evening. God bless you all.